So they did it. Well, that's great. Are they going to have a party? No. How come? Because there's nowhere left to have a party. And no running water. And no electricity. Yeah, okay. Wow. All right. March 18th, 1951. What happens this week? This week, Seoul changes hands for the 4th time in 9 months. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, UN Forces Commander Douglas MacArthur made controversial statements about the war in general and the recent UN successes in the field. The UN forces also began Operation Ripper the 7th, and it saw advances the rest of the week. It continues this week. Now, last week, 35th Infantry from U.S. 1st Corps advanced to the Albany line, making a position on the east side of the Pukan River. They are joined the 12th and 13th by the 24th and 27th Infantry, who occupy positions on the west side of the river in the Yibon Mountains, just a few kilometers from the Seoul-Chuncheon Road. In the 9th Corps Zone, U.S. 1st Cavalry and 1st Marine Divisions keep advancing and reach the Albany line on the 12th. The 1st Marine Division has with them a recovery team from U.S. 2nd Division. Their job is to search for bodies and equipment left there when the Chinese overran the area last month. Already by the 12th, they found 5 howitzers, several vehicles, and 250 bodies, the latter mainly of Support Force 21. You'll remember their February odyssey. In 10th Corps Sector, U.S. 2nd and 7th Divisions each begin reaching the Albany line the 13th, and the ROK, South Korean, 5th Division does the following day. East of this, ROK 3rd Corps has advanced north of Route 20 in places by the evening of the 13th, and that same day from ROK 1st Corps, elements of the ROK 9th and Capital Divisions occupy a line running northeastward to the coastal town of Chomunjin. There's a problem confronting ROK 1st Corps, though. See, the KPA, North Korean 10th Corps, has been isolated behind the UN lines since January, and it now begins trying to reach the North Korean lines. Okay, both U.S. 1st Marine Division and ROK 2nd Division have reduced it in size and power by hitting it several times in the Andong, Pohangdong, Yeongdeok region. But it still has a headquarters and 3 regiments with about 2,000 men total. By the time Operation Ripper began last week, they'd managed to make their way north through the Taebaks and were in the Irwol mountain region, somewhere around 50 kilometers northeast of Andong. And by this week, they're around Chongbong Mountain, maybe 40 kilometers south of Gangneung, approaching ROK 1st Corps from behind. Corps Commander Kim Jong-il sends elements of the ROK 9th and Capital Divisions south to intercept it. The morning of the 13th, they duke it out on Chongbong. But after that, it is a cat-and-mouse game the rest of the week. All this is really the end of Phase 1 of Operation Ripper. And on the 13th, 8th Army Commander Matt Ridgway orders Phase 2 to start the next morning. Remember that Ridgway and his intel officers do expect a new Chinese offensive. They thought it would begin earliest mid-month, but it does not do so, at least this week. There are enemy plans for a new offensive, and the communist forces have been growing and growing in preparation for it whenever it is to be launched. Jim Tarkington, Ridgway's G2, intelligence chief, thinks it will originate in the Hongcheon area. So, for Phase 2 of Ripper, Ridgway has in mind the possibility that the Chinese have strong defenses south of Hongcheon. So he tells 9th Corps Commander William Hogue to not make any kind of frontal assault, but take the town by double envelopment. So Hogue is going to hit it with the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division from the west and 1st Marine Division from the east. This kicks off the 14th, and it soon becomes clear there is not loads of Chinese resistance anywhere, just a little small arms fire here and there. Hogue thinks, okay, then also sends U.S. 24th and ROK 6 divisions to continue their advances straight ahead to the Hongcheon River. This they start to do that afternoon unopposed. That evening, 1st Cavalry Division has advanced to west of the town, while to its east, 1st Marine Division makes it to within 5 kilometers of the town by dusk. Everyone else advances without opposition the 15th, with units on the left reaching the Seoul-Chuncheon Road, but at Hongcheon, the cavalry wait west of the town for the Marines to arrive at the east side, right? The Marines, though, actually do meet a strong enemy force, which holds them back, though a battalion of the 7th Marines slips by them enters the town and it falls. It does so because it is in ruins and is undefended. The UN bombers that destroyed the town also sprinkled half of it with bombs that explode when disturbed, as an unlucky truck discovers. So engineers get the fun job of clearing all those. The ease of advancing on Hongcheon has had Ridgway thinking that maybe the enemy is just going to hand over Seoul as well. He already had an inkling of that before, though, to be fair. He has aerial recon from the 12th that shows lots of enemy troops heading away northwest from their Han River positions. And that night, patrols from US 3rd Division cross the river and find those positions empty. The night of the 13th, those same patrols advance a full kilometer without seeing the enemy. The afternoon of the 14th, daytime patrols advance as far as the Seoul-Choncheon Road without contact, and 5 patrols from ROK 1st Division actually enter Seoul, with one of them raising the flag above the Capitol building. None of these guys are fired on by anyone. Seems like the enemy really is gone. UN forces, including part of the Belgian battalion, now attached to 3rd Division, searched the city and its surroundings, still unopposed, and an ROK patrol heads nearly 10 kilometers north of the Han before drawing enemy fire. Aerial recon that day sees nothing in and around Seoul until around 10 kilometers north of it, like halfway between Seoul and Uijeongbu. But up there are serious enemy defensive positions, and communist forces extensively deployed both east and west of Route 3. On the 15th, then, Ridgway tells 1st Corps Commander Frank Milburn to occupy what will be called the Lincoln Line, which commands the heights west and north of the city before running northeast to join the Buffalo Line position in U.S. 25th Division zone. Ridgway does not, however, allow him to advance and engage the enemy, except for patrols. And this applies to 25th Division as well. He just wants to follow the enemy withdrawal. The 16th, the UN forces head north, and as expected, do not face opposition occupying the Lincoln Line. The capital city, as it changed hands for the 4th time, was a shambles. Bombing, shelling, and fire since the 8th Army had withdrawn in January had taken a large toll of buildings, and it heavily damaged transportation, communications, and utility systems. 2 months of work would be required to produce even a minimum supply of power and water, and local food supplies were insufficient even for the estimated remaining 200,000 of the city's original population of 1.5 million. So this time, there's no big ceremony or anything. MacArthur does visit Korea this week, sure, but that's on the 17th, and then just to inspect the 1st Marine Division as it's about to attack towards Chuncheon. They do this from east of Hongcheon after the enemy opposite them withdraws. After that, they meet only light resistance advancing north to the Buffalo Line. 1st Cavalry Division, however, west of the city, ends up meeting a lot more resistance, indicating perhaps they might run into strong delaying actions on Route 29 from Hongcheon to Choncheon. So the 16th, Ridgway tells Hogue to send all of his divisions forward to help the advance above Hongcheon, hoping that those advancing west of the cavalry might threaten the flank of any Chinese opposite. On the 17th, only the cavalry meet any strong resistance, with attack and counterattack all day long, but today the 18th, that's over, and it is clear the Chinese have withdrawn, and Ridgway orders 9th Corps to continue the attack towards Choncheon. Further east, Ned Almond's 10th Corps reaches the Idaho line the 17th, and really only had tough fighting one day, the 15th. Interestingly enough, prisoners they take say the KPA, the North Korean, 5th, 2nd, and 3rd Corps are withdrawing above the 38th parallel to reorganize and get set for future offensive operations. So today, as the week ends, Ridgway tells his Eastern 3 Corps to do serious patrolling recon from the Hwacheon Reservoir area north of Choncheon across to the east coast. Something else happens this week. This week, Matt Ridgway puts his thoughts on the public record. See, he's worried that MacArthur's statement last week that they're only fighting for a stalemate might hurt operations and morale by convincing 8th Army soldiers that these operations and their best efforts are a waste of time and men. So he calls a press conference the 12th and goes on record saying that getting back to the 38th parallel would be a tremendous victory for the Army. I mean, that's why they went to war, right? To prevent communism spreading south from there, and the Korean Peninsula. He also says that if the communist forces do not drive the UN forces out of Korea, then for them it is a monumental failure. And whatever the outcome, he says, they did not come here to conquer China. Last week was MacArthur's tie or die speech, with him taking shots at Washington and U.S. policy in direct violation of a December directive. But as we've seen, as 8th Army advances, there are ever more the questions about possible ceasefires and whether to cross the 38th parallel. But there's something more that gets lost. Remember in mid-February when UN naval forces began a blockade and bombardment of the port of Wonsan? Well, that is still going on. That is interesting because 8th Army's orders then about attacks above the parallel were pretty clear. And 150 kilometers north of it doesn't seem to be scattered patrol action incidental to the tactical situation. I mentioned also back then that some South Korean Marines made a beachhead. Okay, what happened to those ROK Marines? I don't know. Do you? No one does, as far as I'm aware. See, the strictest censorship of the war for the UN forces, as strict as that of the communist forces, has settled over Wonsan. Breaking the timeline, it will not lift until the 29th at a press conference in Tokyo when Rear Admiral Alan Smith says that UN naval forces have been bombarding Wonsan for 41 straight days and nights, which he calls the longest sustained naval or aerial bombardment of a city in history, and that they will continue this bombardment of a city of 35,000 people, or of a city that used to have 35,000 people. These are some of his words. In Wonsan, you cannot walk in the streets. You cannot sleep anywhere in the 24 hours unless it is the sleep of death. He says that the population has been reduced to suicide groups, and he also informs the world that the ports of Songjin and Chongjin are getting some of the same treatment. So, why the silence? Why the total cloak of censorship? Certainly not to prevent the Chinese or North Koreans knowing about it. The North Koreans, especially on the East Coast, cannot fail to know about it. The only conceivable purpose of the censorship was to hide from public opinion at home the fact that, while a crossing of the parallel seemed to have been delayed, naval forces were subjecting 3 ports far to the north to a savage bombardment without precedent in naval history, imposing untold suffering on the population and embittering the enemy at a time when there were renewed hopes of peace talks. There were British warships participating. Why did the British government keep silent while this was going on? Was it any less of a crossing of the parallel in force than if it had been purely an infantry operation? And does their silence help convince MacArthur that the officials he's dealing with will protest, but after that, they'll let him get on with the business of doing whatever the hell he wants to do? And that concludes this week of the war, with the UN forces taking more ground, even taking Seoul, but not really hurting the enemy's capacity to wage war, and Matt Ridgway speaking out. What Douglas MacArthur wants to do, as we know, is make war, and he has helped. While this totally censored massive bombardment was getting going, what was his Tokyo headquarters releasing to the world? Wildly inflated claims about the Chinese fourth phase offensive. Over 150,000 men attacking, swarming out of the hills like fleas, according to the London Daily Herald. Talk everywhere of attacking human waves. And the reality? Well, as an example, on February 13th, the UN Air Forces flew over 600 close support sorties. An estimated more than 650 communists were killed in either strafing, bombing, or napalm attacks. That's a little more than 1 per sortie. Isidore Stone writes, if the planes were really strafing an enemy in such numbers that they seemed to be swarming like goats or fleas, it seems incomprehensible that each sortie, even by the Air Force's own sometimes generous estimates, could not average more than 1 and a fraction men killed. It gets even more out of hand. A couple days after that, it was being called the Wonju Shoot, and there were so many enemy dead that the communists themselves called the area Death Valley. However, Ned Almond, promoted that day to lieutenant general, told the reporters gathered that the UN forces had located what he thought to be a concentration of the enemy. Thought to be. After several days of fighting human waves pouring against them, he still wasn't sure. The next day, the bombardment of Wonsan began. Well, they do say, don't believe what you read.